Hello and welcome back to the channel. This is the Tiberium theory crafting video talking about the visitors. Not the scrin, but the visitors. And making polite speculation about their origins. There are some questions that are fundamental to humanity. One of the most fundamental is, am I alone in the universe? What's over that hill? What's over the next one? Another one most likely to be posed after discovering a new rival, is, are they dangerous? Could I take them? And should I hit them first? Humanity has been asking this question for thousands of years, inventing gods and demons, and more recently, space aliens, to try to answer it. In modern times, as humankind pulled itself from gross superstition, the leading nations of the world spend billions of dollars a year investigating the possibility of life on other planets. From those that might signal back to us, to microbial life that might be found in a puddle on Mars. However, to this date, nothing brought forward has either withstood scrutiny or the agents of the governments of the world. That was until the green crystal fell to Earth. It was certainly alien, and as it evolved, many a scientist wondered if it was a form of crystalline life. It ravaged the landscapes of the world and killed millions, dragging the world into a series of war that would lead to the death of billions. Dr. Ignacio Mobius speculated, somewhat correctly, that the crystal was a terraforming device, designed to make Earth inhabitable to aliens used to other conditions. He was wrong, but not completely. Aliens were real, and they had visited Earth in the near past, but they were not here to make Earth a paradise world for themselves. They were here to make Earth a giant strip mine, where the crystal would suck the resources from the Earth and make it easily accessible to the empire of the visitors far out into space. These visitors, who we mistakenly called the scrin, wanted everything we had, and nothing but a messianic cult leader could have stopped them from succeeding and wiping us off the face of the universe. We are not alone in the universe. We never were. Not just because the Drake equation essentially proves it to be a certainty, but also because living proof fell down from the sky and literally shot us in the face. But who are the visitors? Who are these aliens that we mistook for the scrin? How vast is their empire, and why do they crave Tiberium so? Without a final game in the series, these are likely things that we will never know for sure. But just because we don't have all the facts doesn't stop us from wondering, from speculating about the topic. But what tools does one actually have to speculate accurately about something so broad? Well, there are context clues to go on, from cinematics, in-game voice lines, or objects, and data entries. But is that enough? That really depends entirely on your own judgment. The implications can lead us to certain conclusions, and may certainly lead us to conclusions it is possible that the authors came up with themselves. But for me, at least, I need a little something more. For that, for the purposes of this video, I will be taking into account information gleaned from a reading of the Drake equation, and real-world requirements that alien visitors would absolutely need to follow in real-life scenarios. Reaching a war-accurate and also realistic version of the story is, after all, the goal of the channel, by explaining as much about the world as we can with whatever tools we are provided. I hope that you will listen to this and come to your own conclusions. Tell me your thoughts in the comments of the video. If you like the video, hit the like button and comment too, because these videos take a long time to make compared to the videos about the individual units, and every bit of your input goes to making these videos better. Special thanks to BadGuy292 and some of the commenters for their help with this video. The critical question being asked today is, what is the empire of the visitors? It spans multiple galaxies and feeds upon worlds filled with sentient creatures, yes, but is it an empire like the Klingons from Star Trek? The Empire from Star Wars? Perhaps the Borg? Are they an empire seeking to dominate over all corners of the galaxy, the way we imagine in movies, books, and games. By that extension, how large are they? And how likely is it that the threat to invade Earth with an actual military force will be enforced within the lifetimes of the people in the Sol system? Do they have a base of operations? And how long have they been bumping around in the local galaxies? Finally, why do they need so much Tiberium? These questions are what I will attempt to answer today in the absence of information from an imaginary fourth game. First questions first. What sort of empire is the Empire of the Visitors? And does it qualify as an empire, a state, a national entity in the way we would recognize? Well, to begin with, let's classify the force that arrived on Earth. When the aliens arrived on Earth, they did as especially aggressive assaulters, meaning to take control of the planet. That certainly sounds like the move of an Imperial force, a hostile group moving to conquer and annex new territory. But that wasn't quite what they were doing. In the cinematics during their campaign, and in the notes that we see in both the Allied and Nod campaigns, we can take notice of their monikers. Their commander on the battlefield is called a foreman. Their superior is the supervisor, and there's the overlord. With the exception of the overlord, these are terms used in fields like manufacturing, mining, and timber industries, that sort of thing. From that, and the statements made in the cinematics, we can glean that they are, in fact, not an invading force, but what you might call a private military mining company. They have subsidiaries, or mercenary companies, in Reaper 17 and Traveler 59, who each have their own specialization in the field of Tiberium extraction, and they have a quota to fill. It is also hinted at that they threaten to invade Earth with their actual military, a threat that would put everyone on Earth to a bout of mortal fear, as their PMC forces nearly caused the extinction of the species. Additional hints of this come from a reference that the scrin make towards Earth being a previously seeded world, a way of framing the infection of the planet in a way that a farmer might talk about sowing his fields. If they are, by that conjecture, farmers or miners then, and their hierarchy seems to imply that going all the way up to their second highest level of society, the part of it that we can see at least, and they are not likely what we see as a typical species like the Klingons, the Romulans, or the Empires of Earth. Their motive isn't real estate necessarily, it's the crystal. I mentioned in a previous upload that Tiberium pulls the resources of entire planets from the crusts and deposit it on the surface, where it can be mined at the convenience of the exploiter. From our human perspective, this makes a fair amount of sense. After all, the value in Tiberium to us is in the materials it can be broken down into. The fuels, the metals, the component pieces that are leached from the soil that we need to fuel our industry. In addition, Tiberium itself has shown itself to be capable of producing electrical energy, making it valuable to many forms of energy generation. And while that is certainly part of the picture, it is likely more than that. On the final battlefield, when the last threshold gate was completed, Nod and GDI became aware of structures called relay nodes, which according to the scrin campaign were required to emit Tiberium-based radiation that was required to power the units of the visitor military. This structure was destroyed and deactivated most of the visitor units on the planet and caused, at least formally, the end of the Third Tiberium War. The relay nodes, the one destroyed in that mission being the final of many required nodes, had a range all the way to the moon, suggesting that the radiation from these devices was fatal to all non-Tiberium-based life forms under prolonged exposure. This, as Kane himself makes plain, suggests that the aliens cannot be without Tiberium without dying. Indeed, he makes a point to say that the visitors are, in fact, a cult of addiction in the guise of a species. It seems especially poignant given the designation given to Tiberium by the visitors, Ichor, or Ichor, which is a word that has its roots in Greek mythology, meaning blood of the gods. Interestingly, ichor is a substance in mythology that provides the gods with their immortality in ever-young forms, but it is also poisonous to mortals, killing them instantly. Out of universe, this is a very interesting twist on the substance introduced by Dune, the seminal classic, where spice produced on a planet of Arrakis was able to produce immortality and special powers with repeated uses, but it was also extremely addictive. Exposure to the spice gradually mutates the creatures taking it, granting them powers of foresight and farsight, enabling the feudal spacefaring civilization in the Dune series to exist in the form that it does. This is an important point considering that Westwood Studios made the Dune RTS games as well, and are naturally very familiar with the source material. It is said that the reason that Tiberium as a resource was created was to make a single material that the player would have to manage and acquire, just like spice from Dune, and one can really see from this standpoint how much inspiration was taken from the book series. Combining that with all the motifs from the 1957 film The Monolith Monsters, one can see where the idea for the crystals were taken from. In that way, we can see the sort of visitors as an extension as the factions of Dune, entirely taken over by spice until not one of their peoples can survive without it, creating, just like Cain said, a cult of addiction in the guise of a species. This sort of reverence for the crystal is interesting, considering their rather mundane seeding and processing operations, though this could also be seen as being a divine process as it involves celestial bodies, though this is also likely too much anthropomorphism. Perhaps the majesty of the crystal is instead derived from how it sustains their lives, makes them stronger, shapes their bodies, and transforms all life into itself. Given how much similarities there are between spice and ichor, it can be construed that the crystal plays a similar civil role to that of spice. This can be supported that while the goal of the species isn't necessarily to dominate every star, it does seem to be to control all sources of the Tiberium and to propagate it. Every facet of this process must be supported by a form of infrastructure, and unless we are to believe that the visitors can make something out of nothing, which seems quite unlikely, as then they would not need to seed new worlds with Tiberium and merely create more from energy from their power plants. Whether this industry is planet-side or somewhere out in the dark reaches of space is unknown, although it seems likely that the visitors would have their own planets out there somewhere with which they store the troops and materials that they warp in with their wormhole technology. Where there is a military structure, there must also be a civil structure supporting it, as no culture springs fully into being as a military order. What this structure is has no solid foundation in the war, but there are some questions we can ask that suggest some of the answers. For instance, when the visitors mined a seeded world to the smallest bits of Tiberium, they must be carrying off billions and billions of tons of Tiberium. What could they possibly need with that much Tib? If they use it as food, and they have many operations running across multiple galaxies, that must mean that they have a truly gargantuan population to serve, whether within their core worlds or across their galactic holdings. The basis for the multiple galaxy theory, by the way, will have to be another video on its own, but suffice to say it is based on the fact that as the visitors notice Earth, they start off on a screen like the one I am showing now. One of the glyphs zooms in and we see a far view of a galaxy, the Milky Way. If each of these glyphs represents a galaxy, then they must have dozens under various stages of control. Another question that suggests an answer is based off the premise that they not only use Tiberium for food, but also for raw materials in their civil industry. That suggests an unimaginably massive set of core worlds, built up far beyond anything that we could possibly imagine. If they reside in a relatively small system like us, I could imagine that they could use the materials from the Tiberium from countless seeded worlds to build structures as large as Dyson spheres, perhaps as large even as the entire solar system itself, extending out so far that it scratches the limits of the star's gravity. Such a sphere wouldn't even have a limitation on how long the star would live. If materials were fed into it every day, more than it would be burned away, the star could continue shining indefinitely. Additionally, should the original Mobius presumption be correct, and the crystal is really a terraforming device, which I don't suspect to be true, but could very well be true, then this could take a few different forms. One of them is combining what we know about the relay nodes with the expansion rate of the crystal. Perhaps the visitors construct these nodes on planets and then settle on them after they've been cleared of life, moving portions of their populations there to begin mining a nearly infinite supply of Tiberium for the purpose of building a civil infrastructure on the planet, turning it from a war-torn world into a metropolis capable of sustaining billions of Tiberium-affected visitors. The next question to answer is, how large are they as a force? In a cinematic, it is implied that they have multiple galaxies, but that doesn't really tell us anything specifically. To answer that, we should look at the harvesting operations they have across the galaxies. How many operations do they have going at once? Well, that sort of depends. How many intelligent post-industrial age civilizations are in each of the galaxies? Well, that depends on how you solve n for the Drake equation. Our only real tool in this scenario. Why use the equation? This is because, as the visitors tell us in the cinematic, they only seed worlds with intelligent life on it, based on some inherent property to Tiberium, presumably. For those who are unaware, the Drake equation is n equals r asterisk times f p times ne times fl times fi times fc times l, where n is the number of civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy with which communication is possible, and r star is the average rate of star formation in the galaxy, fp is the fraction of those stars that have planets, and e is the average number of planets that could potentially support life per star that has planets. FL is the fraction of planets that could support life that actually develop life. Fi is the fraction of planets with life that actually go on to develop intelligent life. FC is the fraction of civilizations that develop a technology that releases detectable signs of their existence in space. And L is the length of time for which such civilizations release detectable signals in space. The outcome of the equation really depends on what values you put into each of the variables, and these variables could range depending on the constraints that you put on them. For instance, if we assume each value is above 1, then the value that we get is going to be fairly high, shown on this chart as much as 15,600,000 different civilizations. But also, if you assume that with constraints like the rare earth hypothesis, the values will be smaller than 1, that means that it is extremely unlikely that there's another species like us in anywhere in the supercluster that we exist in today. This last bit of information shows that the answer can vary wildly between only one sapient species in the galaxy, or perhaps the universe, to as many as over 15 million. Now, I'm not an astrologist, nor am I a mathematician, so take everything I say here with a rather large grain of salt, but I believe we can refine this quite a bit. I believe that the fact that the scrin, the visitors, only seed intelligent life across the galaxies, this implies that many such species exist, otherwise they would target more abundant sources of life for their Tiberium harvesting. Now, how many there are in the galaxy when all values in the equation are positive is likely determined by the L variable, the variable that determines how many years the subject is capable of sending and receiving messages. These numbers are fairly low at around 304 years, based on post-classical civilizations, based around the idea that all civilizations fall and end. Essentially, there is a doomsday clause built into the equation that assumes we're going to nuke ourselves to death before we get very far at all. Now, I can understand where they get this from, historically speaking. Since time immemorial, humans have been fighting each other and brutalizing each other for limited resources. The more mature the species became, the bigger the rocks we threw at each other became, until they could destroy whole cities at once. Assuming this trend continues, we will kill ourselves within the next 100 years. I don't tend to believe this, however, as I am a student of classical and ancient history, and I might remind people that the Romans, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, all were rounded civilizations for thousands of years as one contiguous state. And if I may ask, how many nuclear bombs did the US drop on the Soviets before they had the bomb, when we had them at our mercy and they were hanging over Europe like a plague, waiting to wipe out all the undesirables in the world? How many did we drop on China when MacArthur wanted to end their threat once and for all? None. And not only that, the only states trying to use nukes as weapons in war these days are extremist states, not afraid to kill their own people in droves for believing a small variation of their country's faith. Now, I am more inclined to change the definition of L to be a larger number, not quite as large as 10 to the 9th power, but something closer to 2,000 for the oldest human contiguous civilization, 10,000 for recorded civilization, or 200,000 for as long as humans have been around. Ultimately, this number could be anything, as I personally believe that once humans are able to make it to space properly, we will manifest our destiny across the stars, and never die out as a species. For this video, I will use the 10,000 number, which comes out with the equation at 156 civilizations per galaxy around the size of the Milky Way. In the event that this is true, that would mean that the Visitor Empire might have as many as hundreds of different operations going at the same time. For a frame of reference, if I were to use a much higher number, such as the 10 to the 9th power number from earlier, I wouldn't have much faith in it, as it would suggest that either the Visitor Empire is so truly colossal that they wouldn't need to move from one galaxy to another to have virtually endless amounts of materials and living space. An important component to visualizing their empire, I feel, is recognizing scarcity, and by that I mean that although I recognize that their empire is massive, it can't possibly be that massive. Although, on the other hand, this could also be true, since we haven't really seen any radio signals from alien empires since the foundation of SETI in the real world, and the Fermi paradox does suggest that this could be the reason. In effect, most of them don't survive longer than the beginning of the information age because the visitors eat them. Confusingly contrary to what I said earlier, using the above numbers, I also want to take a moment to suggest that the Visitor Empire might be much, much larger than we're shown in game. For instance, if they are spread out enough in one galaxy to warrant finding another to find sites for Tiberium propagation, it is likely that the first place that they would look would be the many satellite galaxies around the periphery of the major galaxies. The number of operations could therefore be much larger, closer possibly to thousands of active operations at a time. There are dozens of such galaxies around the 3 major galaxies in the local group, and traveling to any of them would be far easier than a trip across the 2.538 million year trip at light speed that the aliens would likely need to take between the Milky Way and Andromeda. This actually gives a good tipping off point for the next question. How long have the visitors been around? Well, there's no telling how long they've been in the Milky Way or if they originated in the same galaxy as us, as there's really no direct evidence from the plot one way or the other. One way to make an educated guess, however, would be to ask ourselves how the visitors get around in space. Do they have faster than light travel? If they do, then depending on the speed of the travel, we can determine a sort of hypothetical baseline from which to argue. Combine that with the assumption that they need to travel the same way from one galaxy to another in a straight line, like we do, and not just teleport anywhere that they can see, and that sort of narrows the time down further. Let me say it in a different way. Say the visitors, as the wiki suggests, do not have FTL tech, and must travel at sublight speeds everywhere. Assuming they travel from one major galaxy to another, say Andromeda to the Milky Way, they would need likely much more than the 2.538 million years to go from one side to the other. Assuming they made it there on the first try, that's 2.5 million years to add to the counter. As they are suggested to have many more galaxies under their control, add anywhere from 2.5 to 20 million to 100 million to much, much more in just travel time. Assuming that they have their threshold tech, they won't need a return journey. Next, assuming that they began in the middle of the galaxy, which I know they likely did not, but for the sake of making the calculations easier, they would need over 50,000 years at light speed to reach the edges of our galaxy. Assuming the surveying being done repeatedly over the lifetime of their being in the galaxy, they would need many, many trips across to fully explore it. Heck, on 500,000 years for a fully explored major galaxy, and add maybe 100,000 for the smaller ones that are on the periphery. Assuming they only have two galaxies, we are looking at a potential of anywhere between as much as 5 million years to occupy each. If they have many more galaxies than that, as the cutscene seems to imply, then we might be looking at a species that has been around from 10 to hundreds of millions of years. On the other hand, if they do have FTL, that cuts down on travel by, say, half. They only have two galaxies, as we postulated earlier. They might have been around in this form for us upwards of 2.5 million years. Cutting that time in half again, the number falls to just 1.25 billion years, and so on and so forth. It is possible that one may cut this time down further by construing the use of their teleportation tech as an FTL, but it seems that this species is at the very least millions of years old. Being around that long, addicted for that long, with as much population as they're likely to have, it is no wonder that they need so much Tiberium to sustain themselves. Finally, should we be afraid of retaliation? Well, that falls to another question tree. Do they have the Threshold Tower as an active teleportation resource? And do they have FTL? If the answer is yes, that they have the Threshold Tower, and yes, they have the FTL, then the invasion can be expected probably any day. If the answer is no to the Threshold Tower, but yes to the FTL, then we're likely in danger, but it will come in a few years, anywhere between 1 to 2 in all likelihood. If the answer is no to the Threshold Tower and no to the FTL, it really depends on their near space, and the response could come anywhere from 5 years to decades from now. And lastly, if the answer is yes to the Threshold and no to FTL, like I said before, the invasion can be expected any day. Ultimately, this is all just speculation. The Visitors are an empire that is large beyond the scope of human imagination. Whether they have one galaxy or many, their capacity for violence is far beyond anything we can fathom as mere humans. Take in mind that the Overseer did mention that there is no precedent for a species resisting them when the seeding is carried out correctly. Whatever happens, in a theoretical Fourth Tiberium War, it is blindingly obvious that it'll be a stellar war. Humanity will have to make it to the stars to be able to resist the might of the Visitors. The cooperation will be paramount in this effort, as a full invasion will likely be something that no one faction, even between ones as full of hatred of each other as GDI and Nod, could ever begin to hope to challenge. A battle fleet sent by the Visitor Empire could very well be the end of the human species. Well, I am looking forward to hearing what you guys think of this. We're at the end here, and I hope everyone liked it. I want to take a moment to point out that I have a Patreon message in my description, and I also have a Amazon affiliate link if anyone wants to use that. I get a small cut of whatever you buy. So, if I also want to say that, this is a discussion as far as I'm concerned. I want to hear what you think about the origins of the scrin and just how large of a threat that they are, because as I was doing research for this, I realized that there is not a lot of information, and the speculations could go a lot of different ways. Now, I've given you what I think is my preferred version, but I am looking forward to what kind of things you guys come up with. Anyway, I hope everyone has a wonderful week. This has been Game Master Karakin, signing off.